Japanese wrestling, and particularly the way Gedo books, there are a lot of nods to history in the way he does things. So it has value also in reflecting upon current times as well. So the tournament history of the G1 goes all the way back, really, in throughout the entire history in New Japan. So almost anyway. So New Japan was founded in March of 1972. If you're a hardcore New Japan fan, you know that because they celebrate it every year with the anniversary show. They wanted to come up with a tournament, and they came up with it in 1974. So only 2 years into the formation of the promotion, they came up with this idea of an important tournament. It was not called the G1 Climax. That wouldn't come until much later. It was called the World League initially in 1974. And this first format was unnecessarily complicated. Let's just put it that way. I'll explain in a second. So they wanted to come up with this tournament. Now, getting guys for this thing was a little tricky. All Japan Wrestling, its top rival, had the affiliation with the National Wrestling Alliance. So a lot of the top foreign talent went over to All Japan. There was a third company called IWE, International Wrestling Enterprise. And they often booked the AWA champion. Okay, can't have him. So there wasn't a whole lot left. A lot of the top guys were already tied up working for Baba and the IWE and things. But Inoki was able to put together a tournament with some foreigners, and the foreign people were very interesting. So the first tournament had a Japanese bracket and an international bracket. And each of those brackets had 7 guys in them. 8 guys in them. What they did was they had an international bracket and a Japanese bracket. They had a round robin in each one. Then they had the top 4 from each advance and have another round robin. And then at the end of that round robin, there was a 3-way tie. So at the 3-way tie, they had a tiebreaker where the 3 guys had 2 matches in a night in another round robin. So there were 3 rounds of round robin. This tournament just kept getting smaller. And they finally crowned a champion. Now, I'm going to tell you about some of the people that were in this tournament because it's interesting. On the Japanese side, Antonio Inoki, of course. Seiji Sakaguchi, who was Antonio's right-hand man through a lot of it, both in the ring and behind the scenes. The right-hand man. Masa Saito, classic big-time wrestler there, had a lot of success in the United States. The Saito suplex, the side suplex. And the other guy who finished with 1 measly point at the bottom of the card, just getting going, Katsuhisa Shibata. That's Katsuyori Shibata's father. Will go on to be a New Japan referee. On the international side, the top star was Killer Karl Krupp, who did a German gimmick. And if you're wondering, yes, he was a Nazi. He was a Nazi. But that was the gimmick anyway. So it has not aged well, but we'll move on.
Not great.
Believe it or not, Jeremy, he aged second worst on this show. Because the other foreigner who on the international side who did advance was Invader number 1, Jose Gonzalez, who is the steaming piece of shit that murdered Bruiser Brody in Puerto Rico. So, the fake Nazi is at least second place to the friggin' murderer. So Invader 1, you suck, you piece of shit. So moving on. Stan Stasiak, former WWF World Heavyweight Champion, was there. There was a guy named Khosrow Vaziri, who would become the Iron Sheik later on. Another one was Bolo Mongol. There were 2 Mongols, by the way. They were a tag team. Bolo Mongol was Bill Eadie, who would go on to become the Masked Superstar and one half of the tag team Demolition. So, some real foreign stuff. And there was also a guy
named loved Walter how old Eadie was with that face paint, by the way. That was magic. That was the magic behind the stage.
Eadie's one of those guys also like Freddie Blassie who looked 50 when he was 20. So, I mean, it just even
he looked
more
50 when he was 40. He looked 50 when he was 50.
He looked 40. But I'm saying he looked 50 when he was 20, too. I mean, the guy just always looked old. Yeah. So, and there was a guy named Walter Johnson. Now, not the pitcher from the Washington Senators, don't worry. That was in the early 1900s. No, Walter Johnson, if you look at his bio on Wikipedia, barely mentions pro wrestling. He was the 3-time Pro Bowl football player for the Cleveland Browns who was trying pro wrestling and didn't stick around very long. But there you go. So there's some interesting names there in 1974, but that's who he could get. So you see a little bit of a tie-in with the WWF. Although Bolo Mongol, Bill Eadie would work for everybody in the world. Invader won mostly in Puerto Rico, and Killer Carl Krupp was a heel that would travel around and work just about everywhere. Just one of those guys that always came in, would have a run with the top baby faces, and then move on. Not journeyman, because I don't want to call him a journeyman because he was mostly pretty high up on the card. So in the end, by the way, Antonio Inoki, shocker of all, won the tiebreakers over Sakaguchi.
I'm surprised beyond all belief.
They tinkered with the format a lot in the early days. In 1975, for instance, they had 16 guys, only one block, with the top 5 moving on. The guy that would finish with the most points would skip all the way to the finals. And again, that was Carl Krupp. They really pushed Carl Krupp as the top heel foreigner at that time. Krupp had that spot. Inoki and Strong Kobayashi met in the semifinals. Seiji Sakaguchi, Seiji, and Kintaro Oki went to a double disqualification in the other semifinal. That allowed Inoki to just go straight to the finals, and lo and behold, the owner and top star beat Killer Carl Krupp in the finals again. So he won the first 2. He did not participate in the 1976 tourney. I don't know if he was hurt or if he just decided to step back, but this one was a different format again. 14 guys this time. The top finisher in the points of the round robin went on to the finals. Spots 2 through 4 had a round robin to face him. So they were tinkering with things, trying to get him to work. Pedro Morales, another former WWF World Heavyweight Champion, had the best score in the round robin portion. Killer Carl Krupp again, Victor Rivera, and Sakaguchi were the others and then that one was actually won by Sakaguchi, who defeated Morales by countout. Notice they didn't beat Morales. They didn't pin Morales anyway. So he won that one by countout. Now, in 1977, they just had enough of this crap. Much simpler. One block, the top 2 guys go to the finals. There, we can all understand this one, right? Here are some of the people that were in it. Interesting. The last time you had guys like Krupp was back. You had Butcher Vachon was in the year before. That's an interesting name. But and Pedro Morales, of course, was a pretty big name in 1970s wrestling. But in 1977, much simpler format, they had the Masked Superstar. So Bill Eadie was back under his new gimmick. He actually never worked for Baba. He only worked for Inoki in Japan. Bill Eadie had a lot of nice things to say about Inoki. He stayed loyal to him throughout all that. So if you look, Masked Superstar was always a New Japan guy. Seiji Sakaguchi, again, always getting the hard push. Some other names in this one, though. Nikolai Volkov was there. Johnny Powers, who was the NWF champion. That's a promotion that ran around the Great Lakes, part of Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, so around Buffalo and Cleveland and things. And that's actually his belt, the NWF title, was purchased by New Japan. He went over to Japan and lost it to Inoki as a way to establish a world title in that, because they didn't have the IWGP belt yet. So his NWF title was part of the real legitimizing Inoki, because he couldn't be the NWA World Champion. That was they were tied up with Baba. So in that one, Masked Superstar submitted to Seiji Sakaguchi, and Sakaguchi won the tournament. So those are the very early days of the World League tournament. Now in 1978, they leaned harder into their relationship with the WWF. That was one thing. It was a place to go because, again, the NWA was tied up with All Japan. The IWE was still a thing. That company wouldn't die off until 1981. It just kind of fizzled out. So they lost some key guys and just ended up going bankrupt. But in 1978, they were still viable, and they were using a lot of AWA talent. So who do you go to? Well, the other promotion that's not in that mix is the WWF. Inoki would make some Madison Square Garden appearances in New York. Tiger Mask would make some Madison Square Garden appearances in New York. Guys like Bob Backlund, the world champion, would be coming over to Japan. One of the few foreigners portrayed as a babyface in Japan, Bob Backlund. Pedro also, by the way. But even Andre the Giant was a heel, basically, when he would go over to Japan. But there were a couple of guys that would be babyfaces. And they started leaning harder into that. And they even called this tournament the Madison Square Garden League. And they would have tours, Madison Square Garden. So they promoted the idea of Madison Square Garden as this mythical place, which I guess it was for wrestling, right? And so again, they really promoted that, and we're going to start seeing some bigger names in the future. And we're going to talk about this in the coming weeks as we're going to kind of serialize this little history lesson. So we've seen the early days when they're starting to get some foreign talent like Carl Krug, Bill Eadie and things, but we're gonna pump that up a little bit and get some bigger names once they start doing the Madison Square Garden League in the late 70s. As they work with the WWF, and New Japan itself begins to build a lot of momentum, and it becomes more than Sakaguchi and Inoki fighting off foreign heels. We're going to start seeing names like Fujinami, and also on the cards, not in these tournaments, but Tiger Mask is there. Some of the other guys like George Takano, the Cobra, you know, it's going to start building momentum as a company. And Madison Square Garden League is going to have some big names in it. And we're going to go over as this tournament evolved into what we now know and love as the G1 Climax.